When you see a lot of spotting occurring on a leaf to the point where a portion of the leaf or the entire leaf just collapses, then we start talking about a symptom called a blight. And probably the most common of the blights that you're likely to encounter are the blights that affect tomatoes. If you've ever had a tomato plant that started to get brown leaves in the bottom and then that works up the plant to the point where the plant is totally defoliated, you've encountered fungal leaf blights. And there are basically two different diseases that are involved that we typically see causing blights on tomato with that bottom up sort of defoliation. And both of those are shown in this particular slide. On the left is a disease called early blight. If you live around the Stevens Point area where there's a lot of production of potatoes, you've most likely seen this disease before because early blight goes both to tomatoes and to potatoes. And so we tend to see a lot of this disease up in that central sands region of Wisconsin. The characteristics of the individual spots are that they are relatively large. They usually start out being roughly about a ½ inch to 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and you can see several spots of that size on this left leaf. Oftentimes, if you look very carefully at that dead tissue, what you're going to see is something that looks like a target pattern, so some concentric rings. That's very characteristic of that particular disease. And again, you get so many infections by this fungus on a leaf that portions of the leaf and then the entire leaf begin to collapse. And I have a black arrow showing you an area of the leaf where there are so many infections where that leaf tissue just started to totally die, and eventually this entire leaf will collapse and die as well. On the right is the other, probably more common of the leaf blight diseases. It's called Septoria leaf spot. I see a lot of this in home gardens, particularly in the southern part of the state, but elsewhere in Wisconsin as well. With this particular disease, the fungus infects. It forms a relatively small spot to begin with, usually with a very bleached center and a little bit of a dark halo around the edge, usually black or a dark maroon color. And again, you get so many infections per leaf that eventually the entire leaf collapses and you get total leaf death. These particular diseases can be a challenge to manage. The best time to start managing these leaf blights is actually in the fall after you've had a problem. Make sure you do really good fall cleanup. Collect as much of that old tomato debris that may harbor these fungi as you possibly can and remove it from your garden. If you're a good hot composter, where you have a compost pile that gets up to high temperature and you routinely turn that material so that the outer material that's cold gets to the center where it can heat up and decay, if you're a good hot composter, you could actually compost this material. But if you're like me, and my idea of a compost pile is just that you throw material in a pile in the back of your yard, that's not a good place to put this sort of debris, because if you don't get that rotting and heating of the material, and that material is just sitting around, it can harbor the fungus over the winter. The fungus will sporulate in the spring, and that can lead to problems next year. So it's best to collect up that material. If you don't do good hot composting, definitely get it out of your yard and get it away from where you're going to be growing tomatoes next year. As you go into the following spring and decide that you're going to plant tomatoes again, you may want to consider resistant varieties, although I don't necessarily think that that's a great option in many cases. There are some varieties of tomatoes that have resistance to these common leaf blights. Unfortunately, the flavor of the tomatoes that are produced typically is not that great. What scientists have discovered is that the genes for resistance to these diseases are on the tomato chromosomes very close to the genes for flavor. So what you tend to get is either a plant that's very susceptible to these leaf blights that tends to have a really tasty tomato, or you have a plant that's very resistant that has fruits that taste kind of like cardboard. A lot of the cherry tomatoes tend to have at least some resistance to these leaf blights, and unfortunately you know that the cherry tomatoes oftentimes don't have the best of flavor. So that is an option, but it's not, in my mind, the best option for management. The other thing you should be very aware of when you go to plant your plants the following growing season is try to move your tomatoes to a new area in your garden. You want to keep them away from where you had tomatoes last year. That's because even though you've been really diligent about collecting up all of the old plant material from last year, there are going to be little bits of leaf that you haven't been able to collect that have filtered down into the soil. Those are going to harbor these leaf blight fungi, and those are going to produce spores, and those can potentially lead to additional infections the following year. So you want to move your plants to a new area in your garden if possible. Also make sure that you plant your plants as far apart as you possibly can. What you really want to do is make sure that when your tomato plants are full size, the foliage does not overlap. So you want to get good spacing between the plants so you get good airflow. And the reason why you want that is because you want to dry the plants as quickly as possible. So if the leaves get wet, you want them to dry really quickly because these leaf blight fungi really require long periods of leaf wetness, again, a film of water on the leaf in order for the spores to germinate and infect. So good spacing is critical to get good drying. Also, as the plants get larger, you may want to thin them a bit in order to, again, open up the canopy, increase air flow, and also decrease drying time. Other things to keep in mind once you get those plants in place is to mulch under your plants. You don't need much of a mulch layer, maybe about an inch. Quite frankly, I would recommend going back to the area where you had tomatoes last year and mulching over that area as well. What this little inch of mulch is doing is forming a physical barrier so that if you are getting spore production in those little bits of old plant debris in the soil, it blocks those spores from getting out of the soil and to your plants. If you start to see some disease during the growing season, you can pluck off those leaves. That will remove a source of additional spores that might reinfect your plant and will also open up the canopy to promote more rapid drying. The other really important thing to keep in mind as you're growing tomatoes is how you water. Definitely do not use a sprinkler to irrigate your tomatoes because that gets the leaves wet, and again that creates these leaf wetness periods that are very beneficial to these blight organisms and will promote the spores germinating and the fungus infecting. So if you're going to water your tomatoes, definitely water at the base. And what I typically suggest is something like a soaker hose that you can just string along the base of the plants and will apply that water very, very slowly into the root zone where it's needed and keep that moisture off the leaves. So a soaker hose, a drip hose, those are good options for watering tomatoes. If you get absolutely desperate, there are fungicide treatments that you could potentially use. But in my mind, if you need to apply fungicides to your tomatoes, quite frankly, in terms of cost and time and effort, you're probably better off going to a local farmer's market and buying tomatoes there.